Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning. I wasn't here last week. I was in Galashiels Baptist Church, and I was told to say hello to you from them. They're a lovely group meeting down in, well, unsurprisingly, Galashiels. The Lord is doing encouraging things among them, and it's good. It was a joy to be with them. Though must say, I did come home, and one of the first things I said was, I love our church. So I loaned my iPad to Jonathan, and he's broken it. So I apologize. I can't find my notes now, so no sermon. There we go, fixed. It's great to be back here this morning and to be carrying on our series in the book of Daniel, which I know Archie did a great job of last week. Our series isn't just a straightforward exposition of the text that Sarah read so well for us. I'm going to help you with the saying of how we do that in a minute. Abednego's name, because you got to say it a lot. It repeats. Abednego. Anyway, there we go. But that text is really famous, right? It's one of those Sunday school texts because we've got the guys in the fire and they don't get burned. And but the whole point of this series is this question of living in exile. And if we live in exile, how do we live faithfully in exile? How do we serve Jesus? In the very first sermon, for those of you who were here, well, you'll remember that I spent the first part of that trying to convince us that our experience of living in this 21st century post-Christian world is very similar to an exilic experience. Our faith is not the dominant narrative of the world. There are other stories being told. We are not always welcome at the table, all these kinds of things. But the biggest piece was the fact that the cultural narrative wants to change us and wants to disciple us. And what are we going to be faithful to? Or rather, who are we going to be faithful to? And that's the first chapter of Daniel, as we see people carried off into exile, that they're put to work for Babylon, and yet they're still trying to be faithful to God. And then last week, Archie went through that remarkable vision, but really asking the question, how is it that Daniel is able to be faithful with the gifts that God has given him in this space? And there's something remarkable about the way that Daniel works with that. One of the things we said right at the beginning was that Daniel in our Bible exists in the prophetic literature. And in the Jewish organization of the Bible, it actually exists in the wisdom literature. And today's sermon today's passage is one of the reasons for that, because there's no prophecy in this story. In fact, you'll notice there's not even a Daniel in this story today. He doesn't make an appearance. But there is a huge amount of wisdom being offered in this passage. And so I have some real sympathy for the fact that this might sit in the wisdom literature rather than the prophetic literature. Daniel 3 is a story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego living out their faith in Babylon, but trying to figure out what it is to live faithfully to God in a culture that doesn't recognize that God. The first thing we see in our text today is that there's compelled worship. Our story begins with Nebuchadnezzar building a giant statue to be worshipped. In some translations, it describes it as 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide. Sarah's, I think, had translated to 90 feet and 9 feet or something like that. I was going to say that it was about 30 meters high and 3 meters wide. So depending on your age or your preference, that's roughly the size. So really tall, but quite narrow. So we don't know what it was. I suspect it's like an obelisk type thing that would have been there. Yeah, We had the privilege a few years ago of traveling to Washington, D.C. I highly recommend it if you get the chance to go there. It's a great city to visit, loads of history, but there's this weird obelisk, right, right in the middle of it. It would be like that, right in the center, made of gold, likely actually plated gold, and it was on a plain, so it wasn't actually in the center of the city. It was kind of outside the city, which is a bit bizarre, and I did a lot of work to try and figure out what the significance of that is. And the answer, after hours of reading, is I don't think there is one. I think it just was there. That was the reason it was there. And what's really interesting to me is that we're not told why he builds this statue. We're not told that there was a great outcry to have a new statue or he wanted to build an altar to a particular god. Because if you notice, we're never told what the statue is actually to. Now, most commentators assume it was a statue to the god Bel. We talked about in the first one. Everybody turns and looks at Bel at that point slightly awkwardly, but don't worry, we're not into that. That's fine, we're not worshipping Bel anytime soon. But the reality is that that's probably what was happening, but we're not told in the text. We're just told that it was a giant statue that was built and people were to bow down because he told them to. What he does is he summons out the powerful people to come for this great dedication ceremony. We know these things, right? We're about to have one in May. The great and the powerful from all around the world are going to get in their little private jets and punch great big holes in the world's environment, and they're going to fly to the UK, and we're all going to get an extra day's holiday. Woo! And there's going to be loads of pomp and circumstance, and there'll be gold galore, and there'll be all sorts of things, and we'll crown Prince Charles, the coronation ceremony, right? We'll see exactly that. That's what this is. Big coronation service for a giant, great, big obelisk in the desert. And we're told 2 or 3 times that actually there's people from all over, nations and peoples of every language are gathered together. And it's really interesting because if we go back to Genesis chapter 11, we get the story of the Tower of Babel, right? This great big tower that was built so that they could get to the heavens. And where is this story taking place? In Babylon, the same place as Babel. And they're building this great big tall thing, and they've got all the peoples and tribes. And what happened at Babel? God said, no, the peoples and tribes are going to be confused because we can't have this. And here they're gathering the peoples and the tribes. And he says, you will bow down and worship this, or else. Or else. The worship is compelled, and it's compelled by violence. And so there's a sense in which we could look at this and go, oh, look, it's about unity. We could try and Duncan was talking about unity here in Portobello among the churches. We know that unity is important to God. But this is not unity. This is uniformity. That's a different thing. They have built this statue, this idol, that looked nothing like the one in my picture, by the way. It's probably just a pointy thing, but I like the picture. They built this statue. And they said, gather all the people from every tribe and nation. And then, on threat of violence, you will do this thing. Compelled worship is not true worship. But I promise you that every ideology in the world that gets power tries to do this. We will compel you to worship the thing we say you should worship, and we will do it on threat of violence. Sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's overt. We'll look at an overt one in a wee minute in the next point. But I want us to remember our story of this, because our story of this is actually Pentecost, when every tribe and nation were gathered in Jerusalem because they were there for the feast, and the Holy Spirit comes in power, and the unity that's created there is not uniformity, because what happens is that everybody starts speaking in the disciples start speaking in tongues that can be understood by all those who've gathered from all these other places. And what do they hear? They hear God being praised. And then they need some explanation, and Peter comes along and paints a beautiful picture of what Jesus has done, and 3,000 were added to that number. It is the opposite of compelled worship. It's compelling. They are worshiping because they are compelled by Jesus. They are struck by the beauty of Jesus. They are drawn to him. Friends, that's our story. We should never, and the church have in places around the world, they have compelled people to worship Jesus. They have become like Nebuchadnezzar. They've said, you will do this or else. It's a lack of faith. Because actually what we need to do is paint a beautiful picture of Jesus, and people will be drawn to him. But here, in our story, it is compelled on the threat of violence. And so we find our heroes in a difficult position. Remember, there was the four of them. There was Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. We've only got the three today. We don't know where Daniel was at this point. And the question then comes, where will they draw their red line? I want us to remember their circumstances here. These are not people who have made a choice to live in a little holy huddle where they're going to batten down the hatches and wait for the exile to be over. Okay? These are not men who said, you know what? If we just go and live really super holy lives somewhere else, then we'll be fine. No, the text tells us in verse 12 that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were well-promoted men, that they had some power. Indeed, they had been set over the affairs of Babylon. Okay, these are people with significant power. Now, I want you to remember that Babylon was an evil place. In fact, when we read in the book of Habakkuk that God is going to use the Babylonians to come and judge the Israelites, one of Habakkuk's complaints is, not them, Lord, they are the most evil among all peoples. And they were right, they did awful things. Awful things. Child sacrifice was a big part of their worship. It's just awful, awful things. It was a terrible, evil place. And they had come to a place of power. So I want us to recognize and be real about this story. That means they turned a blind eye to a whole bunch of things. That's just the reality of it. And I know for those of you that work in big organizations, there will be things almost every day that you have to choose, am I going to make a big deal about this thing or not? It's complicated. Life in exile is complicated. Because you could do, and I'll use an example, have you ever come across Onyeda cutlery? This might be an old person's reference. The Onyeda cutlery, there's a few people know about Onyeda cutlery. Some of the best cutlery you can buy in the world. The Onyeda community was a Christian community. The idea was that they had withdrawn themselves from the world around them. They would make themselves holy and they would make great things, as it happens in this case, cutlery. And they would sell it all around the world. That's how they would live, and they would do that. The problem is the community became utterly dysfunctional, not near holiness. Power came to play, and it was a disaster zone. We could paint pictures of literally hundreds of Christian communities that have tried to do that, where we're going to retreat from the world, build a little wall around us, and we'll become a little holy huddle, and we'll just wait for Jesus to come back. It never works. Why? Because that's not how we're supposed to live. We're actually meant to live in the complexity of this. Indeed, these men are trying to live out what Jeremiah told them to do in Jeremiah 29. Remember, we talked about this the first week. This letter, recorded in Jeremiah 29 from God via Jeremiah to the people in exile, tells them they're going to be in exile for 70 years. Not a short amount of time. That verse where it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and give you a hope and a future." They're exciting verses, but we often miss out the fact that In 70 years' time, you might get those things, but in the meantime, you're going to live in exile. And so how are you going to do that? This is what he says. The Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. This is exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are trying to do, but it's complicated. They will have to turn a blind eye to some things. They'll have to decide, you know what, I can't do anything about that. If you're interested in how we do this practically, come along on a Thursday night to our Reframe program. Part of what we're trying to do is understand the biblical narrative in a way that helps us with these decisions. But they get to a point where they draw a red line. They say, right, bowing down to this big gold statue in the desert, that's a step too far. We are not going to do that. Those of us who live in exile will have to decide where our red lines are. How far will we be assimilated into the dominant culture of our world? You've heard us talk before. We lived in Canada for just about 4 years. And if you go and live overseas at all, you have to embrace somewhat the culture that you live in. So for us, we had to learn to use a different vocabulary. It wasn't a mobile phone, it was a cell phone. It wasn't a pavement, it was a sidewalk, right? These are silly, ridiculous things. And you go, okay, that's fine. We would meet new people. I would say, hi, I'm Glenn. Shake their hand, that's lovely. And I go, this is my wife, Karen. And they would stand there with a very strange look on their face. I go, Karen. And they would still look and go, strange thing. I'm like, wife of me, Karen. And they go, nope, no idea what you're saying. So we would go round and round in circles, and eventually I would go, K-A-R-I, her dad couldn't spell properly, N. K-A-R-I-N, Karen. And they'd go, Cairn. You're like, no, Karen. Round and round we go. Eventually, after we'd been there for enough months to go, do you know what, this is just too much trouble, I would go, hi, I'm Glenn, nice to meet you. This is my wife, Cairn. C-A-I-R-N, Cairn, a thing on the top of a hill. And for the 4 years we lived in Canada, also my wife. Assimilation. We decided we weren't drawing a red line at the way we pronounced Karen's name because we needed to be understood. A silly example. This here, though, or not this here. Oh, there we go. This here, though, is a really interesting image. This is from 1936 in a German shipbuilding yard where they were building warships. And this was being dedicated, and you can see they are all in the position of giving the Nazi salute. Although not all. This man. Can you see him? Top, right in the middle on the right-hand side, up a little bit. I would point, but this pointy thing doesn't work on the screen. He drew his red line. He said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to stand with my arms crossed. Now, that man worked on building the warship for the Nazis, but he would not salute. Now, it's not clear who he is. He's one of two people. He's either a gentleman who was married to a Jewish woman and who had endured significant persecution. If it's him, then he was carried off to a concentration camp, and he lived in the concentration camp. Unfortunately, his wife was was not. She was killed. This is Holocaust Awareness Day, always on Friday. It's worth us remembering the reality of this. It's not that long ago that this kind of thing was compelled by violence. He subsequently was let out of the concentration camp and was forcibly conscripted and fought for the Nazis in Yugoslavia, actually in Croatia, where he was killed. So it's either that guy, or it's another guy who was a Christian, a guy called Gustav Wegert, who refused at all times to participate in the Nazi salute. He lived until the 1950s, but under some significant persecution during the war times. He was part of the Confessing Church, which is a remarkable movement of Lutherans, particularly among the Germans in the Second World War. We have to draw our red lines somewhere. Whoever this gentleman was, chose, in the midst of that, to say, this is my red line. I will not cross it. And our friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made their call. We will not bow down to this golden statue. And this, friends, for us will be difficult. Life in exile will bring up challenges where we don't know which side of the red line this sits. And I've got bad news. There are no hard and fast rules around this stuff. I think there might be one or two. But so I would say, don't kill someone. And as someone who takes a pacifist position, that would be my view. But there are many among us who would take a just war position on war and would say, well, actually, do not kill even has its limits. Different side of a red line. What are our red lines? A question for you to ponder this week. And I really don't think they're always obvious. But this question this week was the one I was trying to think through. Where are you being asked, or more likely compelled, to behave in a way that is dishonoring to God? Where are you being compelled to behave in a way that is intentionally dishonoring to God? Friends, this is the crux of life in exile. It is not easy. It is very, very difficult. So how do we respond? The threat of the fiery furnace is right before them. And they respond with basically no defense at all. Like if they had a lawyer, I suspect the lawyer would have said, no, we can make a good case for you here. We'll make a case based around the fact that you've been involved in lots of good things and you've done lots, and you're really not trying to slight the king here. You're not bowing down to worship. We're going to make a case that there should be an exception in the law here for that. We could make a good case around that. They don't. They say, we don't have to defend ourselves before you. It's incredibly reminiscent of Jesus before Pilate, and incredibly reminiscent of the apostles before the Sanhedrin, who basically go, who are you to judge us? We don't belong to you. We belong somewhere else. Only God can judge, is really what they're saying. And beyond that, they then have this fabulous line. If we are thrown, so we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter, they say. And then they say this: if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Brilliant. Faith. And the argument goes like this. If God is real, then he is able to save, and therefore he will save us. Logical. God is real. He therefore has the power to save, therefore he'll save us. And that's what they stand on. They say, this is our faith. It's a blind faith. They've not had a word of knowledge that God said, it's fine, I'll look after you in the fire. There's no verses in in the Bible that they were clinging on to that said, yeah, when Nebuchadnezzar shows up, don't worry about it, just you go on into the fire and it'll be fine. None of that. Deep conviction. I know who God is. He is real. He can save. He'll save us. That's the first kind of faith. And friends, we need faith like that. God has shown up. God has said who he is. He is real in your life. Therefore, you can do all sorts of things with faith that God is with you. The second one, though, I love this. I had never noticed this until this week preparing this. He will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, just so that you're clear, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So their faith is, God is real, God will save, he will save us. And you know what? Even if he doesn't, I'm not bowing down to that great big stupid statue anyway, because I know my God. Their faith doesn't require God to save them out the fire. Their faith said, God is good, I know who he is, and I trust that he is doing what he's doing. They don't need God to act in a particular or certain way for their faith to be real. They have the faith that, as Isaiah said, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts. They can say with complete faith, God is real, he can save, he will save. And at the same time, in the next sentence, say, and you know what? He might not. And if he does not, he is still real and I will still worship him. That is the complexity of life in exile, to hold those two things together. Because, friends, there is a day coming when all that will be true is the first one. There is a day coming when God saves, and he will save me, and every tear will be wiped from my eye. There will be no more pain, there will be no more suffering, there will be no more death. That day is coming. But there is a day today when death and sickness and illness follow us. This is the life in exile. It is not straightforward to have faith. So what happens? Off they trot into the fire. So hot that the people who take them there get burned up. Normally, it turns out, they would have stripped them naked to put them in the fire because they didn't want their clothes catching fire. But they didn't bother. They just tie them up and get them in because Nebuchadnezzar's in such a fury. So what happens? Well, we know the story, don't we? There's another in the fire. And it's important we remember this, because the Sunday school thing, I think, sometimes just makes us remember, oh yeah, they went in the fire and they came out again. But the point of the story is, there's another in the fire with them. There's a fourth one in the fire. God shows up in the midst of the fire in some miraculous protective manner that means that even the clothes they have don't smell, never mind go on fire. Now, if you were at our Carols on the Beach event at Christmas, you will know there's a fire and it creates smoke and it stinks. My jacket still smells of smoke a month later. Some kind of miracle happened. What do we take from this? What do we do with this? Does it mean that we can go wandering into fires whenever we feel like it? That there's a literal fire and we should just go for a stroll in it because my God saves? Look, daft people think daft things about the Bible sometimes, so just for the avoidance of doubt, don't do that. Okay, don't go walking into any fires thinking, oh, it's going to be all right, it says so in the Bible, right? This is one of those ones that it's an example, not something to be copied, okay? But what we do notice is that their ability to not be burned wasn't a special gift they had, or indeed something to be repeated. It wasn't their kind of Saturday evening party piece when they were gathered round with their friends in Babylon and going, here, watch this, guys. Set something on fire and stick their hand in it. It was a one-off deal. God showed up. The miracle wasn't surviving the fire. The miracle was that God showed up with them. I want you to hear this today, if you hear nothing else. God has shown up for us. This is our message. We were lost. We were in the fiery furnace whether we knew it or not. We were without hope. We were people who were under pressure and had no idea about it. And God showed up. Jesus showed up. John writes, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Matthew finishes his gospel with these words of Jesus, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Friends, the miracle of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is ours today. Not walking through fire, but that Jesus, God himself, is with us. Whatever we face, whatever we're going through, God has shown up and promises to be with us in the same way he was with the three friends in the fire. Listen, there will be people here today facing metaphorical fires, fires of illness, fires of worried about family members, fires of finance, fires of job situation. Those are real. I want you to hear that the miracle of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is yours this morning because God is with you. That is the only hope we have. The only hope we have. This is incredible. It's good news. It's the best news. I don't have anything better for you, right? I really don't. We could spend months and weeks and years reading this together, and I have no better news for you than what I have this morning, which is God is with you. No matter what you face, no matter what is coming down the road, no matter what you're in the middle of, God is with you. This is the life in exile. We are not alone. As you face those difficult questions, where's my red line? God is with you. As you wonder how to respond to accusations or how you respond in those difficult moments, God is with you. That is our hope. That is the rooted place of our faith. We are a people of faith, and we discover that God is faithful. He shows up. And that is the greatest joy we could ever have. How does our story resolve? Well, actually, we end up going all the way back to the beginning again, because Nebuchadnezzar, he sees what's happened, and he goes, oh, praise your God. Nobody must speak bad of this God, or I'm going to chop them into little pieces. Talk about an exercise in not getting the point. You're like, come on, dude. Really? And that's literally it. He says, I decree that the people of any nation and language, we're back to that bit again, who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they're going to be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble. Oh, really? He just doesn't get it. He just doesn't get it. Friends, may we be people who get it this week. We don't enforce our faith by violence. We don't make people believe in Jesus. We don't make people behave like we think they should. We hold on to the fact that everywhere you go today, this week, God goes with you. I had a friend in Aberdeen, a guy called Graham. He called himself an urban monk. He was awesome. I mean, he presumably still is awesome. He's actually related to Jono, which makes him even cooler. But I sat with him once in a coffee shop, just a random coffee shop in Aberdeen, and we were chatting, and he said, "Glenn, you know this place is different." I'm looking around. Looks the same as the place was the last time I was here. He says, no, it's different because we're here. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, God lives in us. And therefore God is especially present in this place just now because we are here. It's different. The places you go this week, your workplace, your home, the people you visit, the coffee shops you go to, will be different because you go there with Jesus. And that place Jesus is. That's got to be a good place to be, right? We bring blessing. May we know how to live that out this week. I'm going to finish with this little quote that's, well, it's not a quote, but it's an idea that came from one of the commentaries I read this week. He says this: life in the exile is never safe. That's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It wasn't safe at all. They come out the other end fine, but it wasn't safe. Nobody's volunteering to go in this fiery furnace. Life in the exile is never safe, yet it is possible to survive and even triumph. Because remember, they get promoted at the end of this. Now, that's a pretty heavy test. That's quite the annual review. Go walk through the fiery furnace, come out the other end. Oh, you can be promoted after this. It is possible to survive and even to triumph. And the faithful need to live in the conviction that the promises of God are true and will come to pass. And that is our challenge this week, friends. We can't do anything about the stuff outside, but we can be people who believe in the promises of God and that they will come to pass. Let me pray for us, and then we're going to worship this God who has said he will be with us through all things. Let's stand together as we pray, if you're able to. Father, we thank you that we don't worship a God who is far off, but one who in Jesus has come near. We thank you that we don't worship a God who has no idea about the challenges of our life, but we worship a God who lived on this earth. I thank you that we don't worship a God who is not powerful, but one who put the stars in space. I thank you we don't worship a God who needs a big gold statue for us to bow down, but who says, I will come and dwell in the praises of my people. And so today, Lord, we worship you, the King of glory, the one who has called us to himself, not on threat of violence, but because of beauty. And as we go into this week, Lord, I pray for each and every one of us that by your Holy Spirit, you will empower us to live lives that are honoring to you and lives that recognize that you dwell in us. That where we are, you are also. Because you promised to go with us. Fill us with your Spirit. Guide us and lead us as we live out our lives in this exilic world, long for the day when one day all will be well and all manner of things will be well. Fill us and strengthen us to be those people, I pray. We worship you.